A sudden whoomp split the night open, followed by the hungry roar of flames devouring wood. My house, my sanctuary of 40 years, erupted into a tower of fire. Heat slammed against my hiding place as the windows exploded one after another, each blast cracking through the darkness like gunshots. I pressed a shaking hand over my mouth, watching the blaze spit sparks into the sky while fear hammered in my chest. The next morning, I saw my son on the television. Wes was screaming my name, kneeling before the charred skeleton of my home while officers rested their hands on his shoulders. But when the camera zoomed in, I saw no grief, only a thin, icy satisfaction in his eyes. I shivered. Was that fire truly the beginning? Or had this story been smoldering long before the flames rose? My name's Phyllis Delaney. At 69, I had learned to trust my instincts about people. What I hadn't learned was how to trust them about my own son. I smoothed my navy cardigan and checked my reflection in the antique mirror, preparing to say goodbye to Wes and little Ellis. It should have been a simple farewell, a grandmother waving off her family for a weekend camping trip. Instead, something cold settled in my chest. Wes stood in the doorway, immaculate in his pressed khakis and designer polo, but sweat beaded along his hairline despite the cool October air. His foot tapped an anxious rhythm, and his eyes wouldn't meet mine. "Just a quick trip to the Blue Ridge Mountains," he said, his voice carrying that practiced charm. "You know how you've been saying you need some quiet time? Mom, Ellis and I thought we'd give you a peaceful weekend." I hadn't said any such thing, but I let it pass. Ellis stood silent beside his father, clutching his worn, stuffed rabbit, his face pale and frightened. "Before I forget," Wes said, reaching into his jacket with movements that seemed too quick, too rehearsed. He pressed a small amber bottle into my palm. "Your sleeping pills. Mom, you look exhausted. Please, take 2 of these tonight. I want you to sleep through the night without worrying about the house." The bottle felt cold against my skin. I turned it over my name, my doctor, but I didn't remember requesting a refill. "Wes, I haven't been taking, please." His hand closed over mine, squeezing the bottle between our palms. "Just this once, for my peace of mind." There was an edge in his voice that made the hair on my arms stand up. In 43 years of motherhood, I had heard Wes use every tone imaginable, but this was different. This was insistent in a way that felt dangerous. I studied my son's face, searching for the boy who used to build blanket forts and beg for bedtime stories. That boy had been golden, literally and figuratively, excelling at everything he touched. He had been my pride, my greatest accomplishment. But somewhere along the way, the golden boy had tarnished. Failed startups, gambling debts, a bitter divorce. I had bailed him out again and again, until 3 months ago, when he'd asked me to mortgage the estate, to pay off what he called investors. Absolutely not. I had told him, this house is Ellis's inheritance, not gambling money. The memory of his face that day still haunted me. Cold, calculating. Ellis tugged at his father's sleeve, whispering something I couldn't hear. Wes's jaw tightened. "Time to go, buddy." He ushered Ellis toward the black SUV, buckling him into the car seat with mechanical efficiency. When he returned to me, his hug felt like an obligation, arms around me but no warmth. "Love you, Mom. Sleep tight." I watched him walk toward the driver's side, when suddenly Ellis's car door flew open. The little boy unbuckled himself and sprinted across the gravel drive, reaching the porch steps as I bent down. Confused. "Nana," he gasped, his small hands gripping my legs. His eyes were wide, urgent, filled with terror no 5-year-old should carry. He gestured for me to lean closer. I knelt down, bringing my face level with his. Ellis looked toward the car, then back at me. His fingers pulled at my collar, bringing my ear close to his lips. "Nana, please don't sleep inside tonight," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I heard Daddy on the phone in the bathroom. He said, the fire is going to fix everything. He said, the old lady won't feel a thing. Nana, please hide." The words hit me like ice water. My blood stopped moving. My lungs forgot how to work. This couldn't be real. Children misunderstood things. Surely my son wouldn't. "Ellis, get in here now," Wes's voice cracked across the drive like a whip. Ellis squeezed my hand one last time, his small fingers desperate against mine. His eyes held mine for a heartbeat longer, pleading, terrified, trying to save me with the only weapon a 5-year-old possessed, the truth. Then he was gone, running back to the car while Wes's eyes burned holes in my back. I stood slowly and watched the SUV disappear down the tree-lined drive. The amber bottle remained in my palm, growing warm from my grip. My heart hammered against my ribs as Ellis's words echoed in my ears. The fire is going to fix everything. Surely not. Surely my imagination was running wild. Children misheard things. Adults said careless words that sounded sinister to little ears. But as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, my feet felt heavy as lead. Ellis didn't lie. In 5 years, that boy had never told me anything but the truth. His honesty was as pure as spring water, as reliable as sunrise. I stood in my bathroom, staring at the bottle. 2 pills, Wes had said. Sleep through the night without worrying about the house. What if Ellis was right? What if the trembling voice of a 5-year-old was more trustworthy than the smooth words of my own son? My hands shook as I unscrewed the cap. The pills tumbled into the toilet bowl like tiny white lies, disappearing in a swirl of water that carried away any chance of the deep, dreamless sleep Wes wanted me to have. I had made my choice. Tonight, I would trust the angel who whispered warnings over the devil who offered pills. The house felt like a mausoleum as I moved through it at 10 o'clock, switching off every light with deliberate precision. Each click of the switches echoed through rooms that had witnessed 3 generations of Delaney family life. But tonight, they would serve as a stage for something unthinkable. In my bedroom, I packed quickly my phone, Robert's gold pocket watch that had survived 2 wars, and a small flashlight I kept in my nightstand drawer. My hands trembled as I folded a change of clothes into a canvas tote bag. Strange how ordinary objects became props in a survival story. The back door whispered open on hinges I'd had oiled just last month. I slipped across the moonlit lawn, my house slippers silent on the dew-dampened grass, and made my way to the old potting shed, nestled 50 yards away, among the ancient oak trees. The shed smelled of earth and old fertilizer, dust motes dancing in the beam of my flashlight. I positioned myself by the grimy window that offered a perfect view of my bedroom, where soft lamplight spilled through the curtains I'd forgotten to close. From this distance, anyone watching would assume I was settling in for the night. Perhaps reading one more chapter before sleep claimed me. Time crawled like honey in winter. Every night sound the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of traffic on Route 29 made my heart jump. I found myself bargaining with God, with fate, with whatever force might be listening. Let Ellis be wrong. Let this be the wild imagination of a frightened child. Let me be a foolish old woman hiding in a shed for no reason except paranoia and too many crime novels. But as the hours ticked past midnight, that prayer felt increasingly desperate. At 1:15 in the morning, headlights swept across the service road that ran behind the estate. My breath caught as a dark van, windowless, Anonymous rolled to a stop near the kitchen entrance. No camping trip took this route. No innocent visit happened at this hour. Two figures emerged from the van like shadows given form, dressed entirely in black, their movements coordinated and purposeful. My stomach dropped as I watched them approach the back door, expecting to see them jimmy a lock or break glass. Instead, one of them reached into his pocket and produced something that glinted silver in the moonlight. A key. The spare key I'd given Wes just last month after he'd complained about not being able to check on the house when I traveled. Just for emergencies. "Mom," he'd said, kissing my cheek with what I'd thought was filial concern. I pressed my face against the window, my breath fogging the glass. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But the key turned. The door opened, and two strangers walked into my home with the ease of invited guests. Flashlight beams began their deadly dance through the downstairs rooms. I watched them move through the kitchen where I'd baked Wes's birthday cakes, through the living room where he'd taken his first steps, through the hallway lined with family photographs spanning 70 years. The beams climbed the stairs like malevolent spirits, heading directly for my bedroom, even across 50 yards of night air. The smell reached me. Gasoline, sharp and chemical, cutting through the clean scent of October like a knife through silk. My knees gave out, and I collapsed onto the wooden stool, my hands gripping the windowsill until my knuckles went white. One of the men emerged from the house, moving with the efficiency of someone following a well-rehearsed plan. He struck a flare, the sudden red light turning his face demonic in the darkness. For a heartbeat, time suspended itself. Then he tossed the flare onto the back porch. Whoosh! The sound was like a jet engine roaring to life. A hungry beast, awakening from slumber. Orange flames erupted across the porch, racing up the clapboard siding with terrifying speed. Windows began to glow like jack-o'-lantern eyes, and smoke poured into the night sky. Blotting out the stars, I watched my bedroom window. The window where I'd stood as a young bride, watching Robert return from work, where I'd rocked Wes through countless sleepless nights, where I'd held my dying husband's hand and promised to carry on, disappear behind a wall of flames. If I had taken those pills, if I had trusted my son instead of my grandson, I would be ash by now. The thought hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over with grief that had nothing to do with the burning house and everything to do with the burning truth. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a random act of violence. This was murder, planned and paid for by the boy I'd carried in my body, nursed at my breast, loved beyond reason or logic. Wes hadn't taken Ellis camping to give me a peaceful weekend. He'd taken Ellis away so the boy wouldn't witness his grandmother's death. The van's engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped away into the night, leaving behind the crackling soundtrack of my life going up in smoke. In the distance, sirens began their mournful wail. Neighbors calling in the fire. Fire trucks racing to save what couldn't be saved. I stumbled away from the window, my legs unsteady as a newborn colt's. If I was found here, if anyone knew I'd survived, Wes would learn that his plan had failed, and a man desperate enough to hire killers once wouldn't hesitate to try again. The woods behind the estate stretched for miles, connecting to hiking trails that led to the main road. I'd walked these paths with Robert, with Wes, when he was small, teaching him the names of trees and birds. Now they became my escape route, branches catching at my clothes as I stumbled through underbrush that seemed to grab at me with gnarled fingers. 20 minutes later, I stood at the edge of Route 29, my house burning like a beacon behind me. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and downloaded a rideshare app, typing in the address of a motel 2 towns over. When the car arrived, The driver glanced at me with concern. "You okay?" "Ma'am, you look like you've seen a ghost." I settled into the back seat, watching the orange glow fade in the distance. "Something like that," I whispered, knowing I was the ghost. Now, a woman who died tonight but forgot to stop breathing. The hardest part wouldn't be surviving what came next. The hardest part would be learning to live as someone whose own son had tried to erase her from existence. The motel room smelled of industrial disinfectant and decades of other people's desperation. I sat on the scratchy polyester bedspread, staring at the television mounted on the peeling wall, watching my own death being reported on the morning news. Tragedy struck the historic Delaney estate last night when a house fire claimed the life of 69-year-old Phyllis Delaney, widow and prominent philanthropist. The anchorwoman's voice was professionally somber as aerial footage showed the blackened skeleton of my home, smoke still rising from the ruins like incense at a funeral. Then the camera cut to the scene I'd been dreading. Wes stood outside the estate gates, flanked by police officers and paramedics. His face was a masterpiece of grief, eyes red and swollen, cheeks streaked with tears, his entire body trembling with what looked like overwhelming sorrow. As I watched, his knees buckled, and the officers had to support him. "My mother." He sobbed into the microphone, thrust toward his face. "I told her to be careful with the candles. She loved those old hurricane lamps. I should have insisted she get rid of them." His voice cracked with what sounded like genuine anguish. "I loved her so much. She was my world." It was an Oscar-worthy performance. If I hadn't seen those men with their key, if I hadn't smelled the gasoline, if Ellis hadn't whispered his terrified warning, I would have believed every word. The grieving son, devastated by his mother's careless accident. The media would eat it up. The insurance company would pay out quickly. Eager to avoid bad publicity, Wes would walk away $4 million richer, and I would become another cautionary tale about elderly people living alone in old houses. My hands shook as I reached for my phone. There was only one person I could trust with this nightmare. One person whose razor-sharp mind and unwavering loyalty had seen me through Robert's death, Wes's divorce, and every crisis in between. Imogene answered on the second ring. "Phyllis, thank God. I just saw the news. Tell me you weren't in that house." "Imogene." "Don't scream." My voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "I'm alive." Wes tried to burn me. Silence stretched across the phone line for exactly 3 seconds. Another woman might have gasped, demanded explanations, or insisted I was mistaken. But Imogene Morrison had spent 30 years as a federal judge, and she knew the sound of truth when she heard it. "Where are you?" Her voice had shifted into the crisp, authoritative tone that had once commanded courtrooms. I gave her the motel address. "Imogene. He hired men. They had a key. If Ellis hadn't warned me, stay put. I'm coming to get you. We need evidence before we go to the police, or it's your word against a grieving son's tears." The line went dead, and I knew that whatever came next, I wouldn't face it alone. An hour later, Imogene's silver Lexus pulled into the motel parking lot. She emerged wearing a black pantsuit that could have been funeral attire or battle armor. Her steel gray hair pulled back in the same efficient chignon she'd worn on the bench. We embraced briefly, two old women who'd outlived husbands, raised children, and thought we'd seen everything life had to offer. "The police are calling it an accidental death," she said as we drove toward the city. "No investigation planned. Wes is currently at the station giving his statement about how worried he was about you living alone." Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel. "We have maybe 2 hours before he gets home." Wes's apartment building was everything he'd wanted to project to the world. Gleaming glass and steel, Doorman, in a crisp uniform. Marble lobby, that echoed with wealth. I punched in the access code with fingers that remembered Ellis's birthday better than Wes. Apparently did 0428. The apartment itself told a different story. Designer furniture mixed with overdue notices, scattered across granite countertops. A 60-inch television dominated a living room, where unpaid bills lay stacked on a coffee table that probably cost more than most people's cars. He's living like a millionaire on borrowed time, Imogene murmured, photographing everything with her phone. I moved through the apartment like a sleepwalker, seeing my son's life with new eyes. The refrigerator held nothing but energy drinks and takeout containers. Empty liquor bottles lined the counter. And everywhere, the detritus of a man who'd chosen appearance over substance, credit over character. Ellis's bedroom was a different world, clean, organized, filled with toys that looked loved rather than expensive. I knelt beside the bin of Legos, remembering something Ellis had whispered during our last phone call, when he thought Wes was in the shower. Daddy hides his secret phone in my Lego castle. Nana. He thinks I don't know. But I see everything. I dumped the bin onto the carpet, colorful blocks cascading like confetti. There, taped to the bottom of a plastic castle that Ellis had built with such care, was a burner phone and a manila envelope thick enough to choke on. Imogene powered up the phone while I opened the envelope with hands that had stopped shaking and started burning. Inside was a life insurance policy on my life. $4 million. Dated just 2 weeks ago. The beneficiary line read Wesley James Delaney in bold print. And there, at the bottom, was my signature. Except it wasn't my signature. The trembling handwriting looked nothing like my firm script. As if someone had tried to copy it while their hand shook with nerves or guilt. Phyllis. Imogene's voice was deadly quiet. She held up the phone, its screen glowing with a series of text messages that read like a contract for murder. Unknown number Job is set for tonight. 50,000 up front. 50,000 when the job is done. Wes, make sure it looks like an accident. She takes sleeping pills. She won't wake up. Wes, burn it all down. I need the payout by next month, or I'm dead. The words swam before my eyes as the full scope of my son's betrayal crashed over me, like a second wave of fire. This wasn't a desperate act born of panic. This was planned, calculated, cold-blooded. He'd taken out an insurance policy on my life, forged my signature, hired killers, and sent his own son away, so the boy wouldn't witness the murder of his grandmother. I sank into Ellis's desk chair, surrounded by his drawings of rainbows and dinosaurs, and wept. But these tears weren't born of fear or even shock. They came from a place deeper than terror, a place where love goes to die. I wasn't crying for the woman who'd almost burned to death last night. I was grieving for the son I'd lost years ago without realizing it. The golden boy who'd been replaced by a stranger wearing his face. Somewhere in the city, Wes was playing the devastated son, accepting condolences, and planning how to spend blood money. He had no idea that his mother had risen from the ashes, or that the evidence of his crimes lay scattered across his own son's bedroom floor. The dead woman he thought he'd created was about to become his worst nightmare. A ghost with a phone full of confessions and a heart finally hardened enough to seek justice instead of forgiveness. The family chapel stood like a tombstone against the gray October sky, its limestone walls blackened with soot from the fire that had consumed everything else. Built by Robert's grandfather in 1892, it had weathered wars, depressions, and decades of family celebrations and sorrows. Now it would witness one final reckoning. I sent the text at precisely 3 o'clock. From a prepaid phone Imogene had bought at a gas station. I'm alive. I'm cold. Meet me at Dad's chapel. Come alone. Or I go to the police. The response came within seconds. Mom, oh God. Mom, where have you been? I'll be right there. Even in text form. Wes's performance was flawless. The loving son. Frantic with relief. If I hadn't seen his true face reflected in those damning messages, I might have believed the act myself. I sat in the front pew where Robert and I had been married 45 years ago. Where we'd baptized Wes. Where we'd held Robert's memorial service just 3 years past. The chapel felt colder than the autumn air outside. As if the stone itself had absorbed decades of grief and was radiating it back into the world. Shadows stretched across the nave like accusing fingers. Behind me, hidden in the choir loft, Imogene waited with Detective Miller and 2 officers. The recording device in my jacket pocket felt heavy as a stone, but not nearly as heavy as my heart. At 3:20, the chapel door burst open with such violence that it struck the stone wall. Wes stumbled inside. His usually perfect appearance, disheveled hair, uncombed, shirt wrinkled, eyes wild with something that looked like panic, barely held in check. Mom, oh my God. Mom. He rushed down the aisle toward me, arms outstretched, his voice breaking with what sounded like overwhelming relief. I thought you were dead. The fire department said they couldn't find. Where have you been? Why didn't you call 911 for a heartbeat? Watching him run toward me with tears streaming down his face, I almost forgot what I'd seen in his apartment. This was my son. My baby. The boy who used to climb into my lap after nightmares. The maternal instinct to comfort him rose in my chest like a tide. But then I remembered the gasoline smell. The forged insurance policy. The cold calculation in those text messages. I stood slowly, my back straight, and held up the burner phone like a shield between us. Drop the act. Wes. I saw the fire. I saw the men with your key. And I read the texts. He stopped dead in the center aisle. His face going through a transformation that would have been fascinating if it weren't so terrifying. The mask of loving son melted away like wax, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. His tears dried up as if someone had turned off a faucet. You shouldn't have looked, he said, his voice dropping to a tone I'd never heard before, flat, emotionless, completely devoid of the warmth that had once defined my golden boy. You selfish old woman. You sit on millions while I drown in debt. You owe me this. I'm your only child, your heir. That money should be mine now. Not moldering away in some trust fund. He took a step closer, and I saw something I'd been blind to for months the way he moved now. Predatory and calculating. When had my son become a stranger? When had love been replaced by this consuming greed? I gave you everything, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I bailed you out of every failure, covered every debt, loved you through every mistake. And when I finally said no, when I tried to protect Ellis's inheritance, you decided to kill me for it. You forced my hand. His voice rose to a near shout that echoed off the stone walls. Those men I owe money to don't take no for an answer. They would have killed me. Mom, killed me, and probably Ellis too. At least this way. Ellis gets to live. You should be grateful you're dying for your grandson's future. The twisted logic of it took my breath away. In Wes's mind, he'd become the hero of his own story, sacrificing his mother to save his son. The rationalization was so complete, so delusional, that I wondered if there was anything left of the boy I'd raised. Nobody knows you're here, Mom. He reached into his jacket, and my blood turned to ice. It can still be an accident. Heart attack from the shock of the fire. You were always frail, always anxious. People will understand. But I stood tall, drawing on reserves of strength I'd forgotten I possessed. I gave you life, Wes, and I gave you every chance to be a good man. But you chose greed. You chose to become a killer. And you used my own grandson as your weapon. That last accusation hit its mark. Something flickered in his eyes, shame. Maybe. Or the ghost of the conscience he'd buried under debt and desperation. Ellis doesn't understand, he said. But his voice had lost some of its cold certainty. He's just a kid. He'll forget. He'll never forget that his father tried to murder his grandmother. And neither will I. Wes lunged forward, his hand emerging from his jacket with something metallic that caught the filtered light from the stained glass windows. But before he could take 2 steps, Imogene's voice rang out from the choir loft, like the voice of justice itself. That's enough, Wes. Detective Miller and 2 uniformed officers emerged from the vestry like angels of judgment, their weapons drawn but pointed down. Wes spun around, his face cycling through confusion, rage, and finally, defeated recognition. Wesley James Delaney. Detective Miller's voice was professionally calm. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, arson, and insurance fraud. The metallic object clattered to the stone floor, not a gun, but a syringe. Even at the end, Wes had planned to make my death look natural, peaceful, accidental. He struggled as the handcuffs clicked shut, his composure finally cracking completely. This is their fault, he screamed, his voice echoing off the chapel walls. The loan sharks. They forced me into this. I never wanted to hurt her. But his protests fell on deaf ears. As they dragged him toward the door, he looked back at me one last time. And I saw not my son but a stranger wearing his face. I refused to meet his eyes. Refused to give him the comfort of my gaze. The boy I'd loved was already dead. What they were taking away was just the shell he'd left behind. The chapel door slammed shut with a finality that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. In the sudden silence, I sank back onto the pew where Robert and I had pledged to love each other until death do us part. Neither of us had imagined that death would come in the form of our own son's greed. 5 years have passed since that October night when fire tried to steal my life. And I've learned that some wounds heal better by the ocean. The salt air has a way of washing clean what time alone cannot touch. The trial had been mercifully swift. The hired arsonists turned state's evidence. Wes's burner phone provided a digital confession, and the chapel recording captured his final attempt to silence me forever. When the judge sentenced him to 40 years, I felt no satisfaction. Only the hollow ache of a mother watching her child disappear behind prison walls. I visited him once. We didn't speak of forgiveness or regret. I simply told him that Ellis was safe, that he would be loved and protected, and that this was goodbye. Some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. The insurance settlement from the estate came to nearly $2 million, blood money I couldn't bear to keep. I sold the remaining land to a developer who promised to build something hopeful there. Homes for young families instead of monuments to old sorrows. With that money and what remained of Robert's investments, I bought this weathered beach house in the Outer Banks, where the horizon stretches endless and forgiving. The guest cottage behind the main house now shelters Sarah, Wes's ex-wife, and serves as a bridge between Ellis's old life and his new one. We'd barely known each other before the trial. Wes had kept us apart with lies and manipulation. But grief has a way of creating unexpected bonds. Sarah works as a marine biologist at the nearby research station, and watching her teach Ellis about tide pools and sea creatures has shown me how healing looks when it grows from genuine love rather than obligation. This afternoon finds me where I spend most of my afternoons now, rocking gently on the wraparound porch that faces the Atlantic. At 73, I've earned the right to move slowly, to watch clouds chase their shadows across the water, to count my blessings in the rhythm of waves against sand. Nana, look what I found! Ellis comes racing up the beach steps, sand flying from his bare feet, clutching a conch shell that spirals like a frozen tornado. At 10 years old, he's grown tall and sun-kissed, his father's wheat-colored hair now streaked with bleach from ocean swimming. The pale, frightened child who whispered warnings in my ear has become a boy who laughs easily, explores fearlessly, and sleeps through the night without nightmares. He plops down in the rocking chair beside mine, slightly out of breath, holding his treasure up to the light. Mom says you can hear the ocean inside if you listen really carefully. I take the shell and hold it to my ear, hearing the familiar whoosh that children believe is captured ocean waves. What do you hear when you listen? Ellis takes it back and closes his eyes in concentration. It sounds like the wind telling secrets. Good secrets this time. The words pierce my heart with their innocence. This child who once carried the terrible burden of his father's evil plans now speaks of good secrets, of wind that whispers comfort instead of warnings. Nana, he says, settling back in his chair and looking out at the endless blue. Are you thinking about the fire again? I reach over and take his sun-warmed hand in mine, feeling the calluses from climbing rope and building sandcastles. No, sweetie, I'm thinking about the whisper that saved us both. He nods solemnly, understanding more than any 10-year-old should have to understand, yet somehow unbroken by that knowledge. We sit in comfortable silence, two survivors watching the tide come in, carrying new shells and possibilities to shore. Later, as Ellis helps his mother prepare dinner in the cottage kitchen, I remain on the porch as twilight paints the sky in shades of forgiveness. I think about Robert, about the son we raised and lost, about the grandson we saved. I think about the house that burned and the home we built from its ashes. They say blood is thicker than water, but I've learned something deeper in these 5 years by the sea. Truth is the fire that purifies us all. And in the end, we didn't just survive the flames that tried to consume us. We rose from them, stronger and more grateful for the light we carry in the darkness. Sometimes the greatest danger comes wrapped in familiar love, and sometimes salvation arrives in the smallest whisper. That October night taught me that a 5-year-old's trembling truth was worth more than a lifetime of polished lies. As I watch Ellis chase seagulls across the sand, I see how we become the guardians our younger selves needed. The voices that speak when others fall silent. The waves whisper their eternal secrets to the shore. And for the first time since that terrible October night, all of them sound like hope. Listen to the whispers around you, they might just save your life. And if this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to remember their own strength. And don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and visit the Grandma Stories channel to discover more heartfelt tales of love, justice, and redemption, because here, every story begins and ends with love.